Hello, my name is Scott Smith, and I'm a technical consultant with the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice at Wayne State University. Today's webinar is designed for law enforcement officers to help you better understand the benefits of assisted outpatient treatment and why it matters to you and the role you play in our community. The benefits of assisted outpatient treatment can be seen in those states that have utilized assisted outpatient treatment already. And of the states that have assisted outpatient treatment laws, New York is one of the most studied because it's had the program for the longest. The average individual that was studied who received assisted outpatient treatment in the state of New York was diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. About 71% of individuals studied had a psychotic disorder. An example would be schizophrenia, or something known as schizoaffective disorder. That's somewhere between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, right? So individuals who frequently experiencing those psychotic symptoms, their reality that they experience is not everybody else's reality. On average, the participants in assisted outpatient treatment had 3 inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations in the past 6 months alone. Almost half were not adhering consistently to their psychotropic medications, and about the same number had a co-occurring substance use disorder. 1 in 3 had been arrested, and 1 in 4 incarcerated prior to having an assisted outpatient treatment order. And 1 in 5 had experienced recent homelessness within the past year. So how well did AOT work to address the problems within this population? Well, during the first 5 years of assisted outpatient treatment in New York, there were substantial reductions in the rates of suicidal behavior, a reduction of 55%. Think about how many calls for service you have that are related to somebody who might be suicidal. Imagine cutting those in half. What does that do to the way you spend your time, the amount of time that you're on patrol? Homelessness was reduced by a whopping 74%. 3/4 of participants were able to get into stable housing. When we think about all of the challenges to obtaining housing, setting aside the financial concerns, the application processes, the following up, the visits, all of those steps are greatly compromised by the symptoms inherent to their serious mental illness. By addressing those symptoms and providing more support in the form of case management, homelessness was reduced so much that it would be obvious within the community that there was a reduction. Imagine what your community would look like with this type of reduction in homelessness, in seeing individuals occupying housing, better participating in society as a whole. Inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations. Recall that on average, they had had 3 hospitalizations in the previous 6 months. Well, this is the biggest effect of assisted outpatient treatment, a reduction of 77%. And this is significant for a number of reasons. Unfortunately, the more somebody is hospitalized psychiatrically, the more likely they are to become institutionally dependent. That is, not get the opportunity to practice and embrace those life skills that are necessary to live outside of some type of institution. And because we have very few inpatient psychiatric beds, because we don't have the same type of hospitals that we once did, this is really critical because inpatient psychiatric hospitalization, when it's repeated over and over again, has an overall negative impact on the individual's treatment, despite it being an attempt to help. When we look at individuals on assisted outpatient treatment at the 6-month point, this is a common framework for evaluating any efforts to reduce alcohol or drug use. What we see is that 6 months in, half were no longer using the substance that they had been before. Half were no longer using a substance. And for individuals with a serious mental illness, the use of substances is only going to worsen their symptoms, decrease the effectiveness of the treatments that's being offered. And that interaction is often what leads to the really unfortunate interactions with law enforcement. Now, additionally, when we look at overall behaviors that were reduced under assisted outpatient treatment during that initial evaluation period, arrest decreased 83%. 83%. As a law enforcement officer, and I should add here that I have a small glimpse into what life is like as I've served as a reserve police officer for several years. Imagine what your time can look like if you're spending your time on patrol, developing relationships with individuals in the community. If you're not spending most of your time responding to crisis calls, that is mental health crisis calls, transporting to hospitals, waiting at hospitals, or contrarily, arresting somebody because under their mental illness, they committed a property crime, they trespassed, vandalized, etc. And even with changes in misdemeanor laws, we know that arrests still remain relatively high overall for individuals with serious mental illness. Reducing the amount of time you spend with that processing increases the likelihood that you're going to be on the street when you're needed. It also will directly translate into enhanced job satisfaction. They'll actually have the opportunity to do the work that you originally wanted to do. Violence. And I want to note here that individuals living with a serious mental illness are not typically violent. We often are led to believe that, but in truth, they're 10 times more likely to be victims of violence than to actually perpetrate it. It does happen, though. Those of you who may have been through CIT training may have heard that, especially individuals who are in the manic phase of a bipolar episode, they experience such impaired impulse control combined with a sense of mission or purpose that's where we unfortunately see more violent interactions with law enforcement. Well, under assisted outpatient treatment orders, violence was reduced across the board by almost half, 47%. And even threats of violence, again, something that constitutes a lot of time and a lot of paperwork, was reduced by 43%. And there's an overall reduction in property destruction. Occupied, unoccupied buildings, we know that this ends up being a big source of police reports, police paperwork, and it's a blight on the community. Well, it was reduced by 46%. AOT is relatively inexpensive to implement, but results in huge system savings, especially to law enforcement, courts, hospitals. What they found in New York was that prior to having an assisted outpatient treatment order, on average, individuals, it was costing somewhere in the neighborhood of $215,000, adjusted for today's prices, just for those hospitalizations in any given period. And for individuals specifically on Medicaid, so receiving public support in that way, it was between $70,000 and $100,000, depending on whether they were in an urban or suburban location. After assisted outpatient treatment was implemented, costs were reduced by almost half across the board. And the cost savings collectively add up, with states reporting millions in savings from effectively utilizing assisted outpatient treatment. And the average cost per person to experiencing these savings, to experience the reduction in crime, the improvement in quality of life, in urban environments, it was around $5,000 a year. That's adjusted for today's figures as well. Suburban areas slightly higher, just over 6,000, but equally resulting in over half of the savings that were spent in previous years on individuals with a serious mental illness. So when we think about why assisted outpatient treatment may be especially helpful to you in law enforcement, I want to think about it from two separate directions. First, through improved community safety that is possible when assisted outpatient treatment is employed. We should see reduced property crime via decreased alcohol, drug use, housing instability, and impulsive behavior. We should see a decrease in the number of mental health callouts, especially repeated callouts to those individuals we see often, those that we're calling the familiar faces. There's the possibility of safer families, because when individuals are getting treated, they're more likely to be able to retain their support systems, which is protective against all the harmful consequences of living with a serious mental illness. And they're going to be less likely to engage in violent behavior towards themselves, towards others. And finally, we should realize system savings that can be spent on other things, community enhancement projects, better trainings across the board, and opportunities for improved collaboration between law enforcement and the community, improvements in overall civic function, and potentially just realizing those savings in a way that decreases some of the burden on taxpayers within the area. In the other area, we should see improved officer safety, because fewer mental health callouts should result in less likelihood to see officers attacked. What we know from the data is that repeated callouts to those familiar faces is often where law enforcement ends up in use of force situations, ends up injured. And we should also see that the callouts for mental health services, especially crisis services, are better matched to the type of training that you receive as members of the law enforcement community. The crisis intervention calls should be more situational than chronic, that is. There should be an overall reduction within this population of situations where the use of force is necessary. And as I mentioned earlier, decreased officer injuries overall. The better crisis intervention that's possible should also translate into improved community relations and public perception. So officer safety isn't just increased physically, but also it's the safety against being subjected to lawsuits, being, the recipients of critique that is often widely applied, but might not recognize the many heroic contributions of the law enforcement community. In Miami-Dade County, which is a great example of what happens when there's an overall improvement in mental health service delivery through things such as assisted outpatient treatment and the services associated with it. The effective intervention had all of these results. In fact, officers were less likely to be injured and file workman's comp claims to the level that it saved the city so much money that their bond rating increased. It actually made it easier for the city to have access to finances. And when these services were initiated, there were 2 very large jails built to capacity. Today, only one of them is still operating. So we know that there's real world examples of how this officer and the community can be safer when effective treatment is offered. Thank you for your time watching this webinar. This training is presented as a part of the Michigan Assisted Outpatient Treatment Toolkit. And to learn more, please visit behaviorhealthjustice.wayne.edu/AOT.